It had been 3 days since their hike. 3 days since Larry, taking a shot, almost scared the crap out of Bianca, quite literally. 3 days later, they returned home, and there was no time to rest. They then had to take care of the young children. Of course, both Larry and Vince had to wrestle their young kids as they all wanted to hang around with Daddy for so long. And of course, they had to play with as much as possible because, hey, kids like to be around the folks, at least for a while. I mean, they're not teenagers yet. They also had to continue to work on their farms. Things had fallen behind just a little bit, so they needed to catch up. Along with that, they had to bend their wives in new and exciting ways to show them how much they still have passion for their mates. Clearly, with all this, there was no time to rest. Just as things were starting to calm back down again, less than a week later, they got a distress call out of nowhere. One of their wonderful spooks had contacted them and let them know they needed to save altered personnel. This surprised everybody because they didn't know there was some sort of global catastrophe. As it turned out, things were so much worse. As it turns out, after the whole debacle between the Nishani and the Forged caused a lot of trouble, a lot of messed up as far as trade goes, and several planets were still in a bit of a depression, they needed a scapegoat. And who better to blame it on than those that had been altered? Every single species that had been altered, at least part of their population had been, was being looked at as the complete and total issue. The reason why they were in such deep debt, the reason their societies were breaking apart, the reasons for all their problems. And they decided on one, shall we say, final solution. Even though when they talked to humans, they all recommended Exodus instead. This was immediately rejected, as they believed humans had no idea what they were going through. Now, those that were altered were going to be exterminated. Humans needed a solution. They realized that many of the humans had started to mix in with these. They had trained with them, they had worked with them, they had made them friends, allies, compatriots, allies, and this couldn't stand. They need to collect everybody they could from those sectors. The problem is, any simple math would let them know there's not enough room on this planet. They wouldn't be able to produce enough food on this planet alone. They would need an additional 4 sectors to put all the refugees in. And, well, Earth agreed. They had absolutely no problem. They began to rush in to set things across 4 additional sectors. This was, of course, inside human held territory, but on each of these planets there were no colonists. The only colony in that area that was even close was Larry's own, Sigma 957. He talked to his wife, and of course, Gregnar was not happy with staying behind as they talked about the battle plan. She was even less excited with the fact that the 2 oldest wanted to join him, and he didn't see a problem with it. The 2 youngest, being as though they are so young, just didn't really understand what was going on, and every time they tried to carry on a conversation, they were more interested in playing. Because of that, they're definitely not being taken for an escort or evacuation mission. No, absolutely not. They would have to stay with Gregnar, and no matter how much she ran the scenario through her head, she didn't have a choice. It was either that or try and keep all the kids there. And try as you might, you are not keeping teenagers on the ground for very long. John and Sherry showed up prepared to rock and roll, both of them with a small pack and wearing combat gear. They already knew what to do. They'd been training, or at least been trained, since about 4 years old. Both Larry and Gregnar were very adamant about making sure these kids knew everything they possibly could. So when not working on the farm, they were learning something. They were going out to train something. Hell, even the camping was there to train them on something. They had to know everything from how to make stone tools to quantum physics. They also made sure that they were ready to fight, as they had been physically trained as well. Larry hopes that they're not going to actually need to fight, but it's better to have and not need than need and not have. When they got up to their ship, Aya and the chief were there to greet them, and immediately stowed their gears. They immediately went right into final checks to make sure everything was ready. Both AIs were definitely up to snuff for this, as they had been able to maintain the ship and even improve it in some ways. They contacted the other humans. Vince, Jenny, and Cindy were all on board, along with about 24 more. They all began to report ready and did their final checks on the plan to make sure everybody knew where to go and what they had to do. At that point, they engaged their fold systems, and the game was on. Larry headed straight to forced space, as that was the sector he was going to be taking care of. He was joined by 3 others: Cindy, a man named Jake, and another man named Andrea. They reached the edge of forced space and immediately began to separate towards different areas. They tried to stay as stealthy as possible, as the less the Force knew about what was going on, the better. The first worlds any of them would reach were some colony worlds. These didn't have much in the way of defenses, so they didn't have to worry about too much. But it didn't take long to see an issue. Aya immediately hooked herself into the local communications array and began to search around to see what was going on. While this was going on, she had to focus primarily on that, which left the rest of the ship alone to Larry and Chief. But there wasn't much to do until she got whatever intel she could. She was back after only about a minute and a half, and she found out that altered personnel are being attacked all over the place. Many of them holding in small hideouts, which were about to be raided. However, they had time. They just didn't have a lot. They immediately deployed the recovery ships and head them straight down into forced space. However, to do this, they had to drop their stealth, and because of that, they were immediately picked up on sensors. The local government was notably pissed and demands to know what in the hell are humans doing here. They continue recovering ops and delay the response as long as they can until the survivors are recovered. The planetary government is notably angry and just continue to send more and more messages, and now they try to send some ships as well. The only response that Larry would send was, "We're just trying to save some lives." The force ships begin to power weapons, and they get well within range of the recovery ships. This was a warning not to get involved with their extermination. As the recovery ships came back up, they were told that the locals could have just engaged their ships and shot them down. But then again, Larry reminded them that would have brought war to their planet. So instead of that, instead of you going and ripping everybody to pieces and causing more death and destruction, something that would be a completely black note inside your own people's history, this is a better solution. The second wave of recovery ships was almost entirely blocked from entering, and there was explosions on the surface. They scanned, and it was absolutely beyond anything they were ready for. It turned out the locals were willing to kill entire towns to get a single one of the altered personnel. Looking down, they could see the explosions as many of the recovery ships just simply turned and came back to the ship. Once all back inside, they realized there was no way of saving any more, and they jumped away as fast as they could, thanking anyone who was listening up above. Oh, it's a good thing we blocked their comms, or this would be a whole lot worse. Each planet was making it more and more difficult to retrieve personnel. Whether it was trying to block their ships, trying to intercept those on the ground from getting there, they received, "Don't try, human!" And Larry simply sent the response, "No matter the odds, we will not stop saving them. They are not human. They are forced. So is my wife, asshole. She chose not to be forced." If she's not forced, then what is she? "An abomination, a freak, a soiled woman, a traitor of her own making." You just said she wasn't forced. In that case, those you are trying to exterminate are not forced, meaning you have no place to claim authority over them. So let us just take them away. "They must be removed to keep us pure." What the hell do you think I'm doing? I'm removing them, you dumbass. I mean, hell, it's bad enough that you've stolen all their wealth, their material goods that they have. You're stealing their land. You're probably going to make them into forced labor, I would assume. I mean, we've seen this before. We as humans, we've seen this before, and we've said the same thing. Never again. Listen, listen close. You will prosper once I get these people out, but not for the reasons your elders will tell you. You need to wake the fuck up to the reality. The reality is you're going to get a huge influx of material, of wealth that comes in, and you're going to think you're going to live high on the hog. Oh, that must be the problems. But don't worry. Eventually, it's all going to come crashing down. And when you try to go off indefinite expansion, bad shit happens. Our own people learned this many times throughout history. It took a long time before our leadership realized how screwed up that truly was, because it does not work. What's next? Are you going to try to invade another one? Are you going to invade the Celtipsians now? Are you going to go after the Ko? Are you going to try to take out the Nishani again to try and keep your own wealth? Before he can even continue on, the comms are cut off. Unfortunately, these type of delaying tactics, screaming into the comms, don't always work. Sometimes you have to put ships between the fleeing altered. The only reason that they would actually not fire at those altered that are running is because they can't see them. They would have to shoot through a human ship. And that would be a bad thing. That would be a very, very bad thing because that would activate the automated defense system and they would not be able to get away. They were warned about this, and they are not going to try their luck against a human ship. The only bright spot in this whole debacle was the fact there was one way of Altered who could get a hold of a ship to get the hell out of the territory. There was one way. They had to get themselves into Vuncian territory. The Vuncian are still on very good terms with the humans. In fact, they're their biggest trading partners. And all space lanes are open. No one is allowed to conduct any type of military operation, no conflicts within their territory. Because of them being trading partners with humans, their ships are now faster and can respond a whole lot hardier than they used to before, which makes them one of the strongest militaries out there. And they are definitely willing to stop the violence with violence. They have taken that lesson from the humans. Almost 3 weeks since the evacuation started. Most of the planets had been reached. The last one that Larry needed to reach before getting them to their new refugee center was Greknar's home system. However, this one was deep inside forced space. The planet was turning itself into pieces with combat, though. The Altered still controlled some space, did have some ships, and they held a small continent, but that was it. They would only be able to hold for a certain amount of time, and eventually a whole bunch of force would come in and just bulldoze the place. There's no way they'd be able to withstand all that. The call goes to the planet to be ready for evacuation, and they immediately sent recovery ships. The stubborn force wouldn't leave. They didn't want to. They wanted to fight and die heroically, die honorably. Well, dying's dying. Larry had to scream out, "There's no point in you dying here. Hostile reinforcements are on the way. I'll even send the data. Here, watch this." With that, he got a response. Surprisingly, it was Greknar's father on the line. He had been altered, but not all that much. He just looks like a force that's, well, on steroids. He was completely stubborn as all hell, and that was until he saw his grandkids for the first time in the background. Larry called them forward and introduced them over the comms. This made his grandfather think, well, maybe it wouldn't be a smart idea to die down here. And of course, sending all his men to die either. He then called someone over. It was Greknar's mother. She was completely unaltered herself and was amazed to see her grandkids. Honestly, she wasn't even sure that's who they were at first. She hadn't seen them since they were barely crawling on the ground. However, with a simple look, she knew it was them. And then she gave a different type of look to her husband. This, of course, made him completely change from being stubborn to, yes, dear, though he was still hesitant to run. Holding back the hostiles would be a bit difficult. Eventually, they had to land the recovery ships between the friendlies and the hostiles. And those who wouldn't actually get on, they had to scream out, "Park your fucking pride and get on the fucking ship!" While loading up, forced battle groups actually arrived in the system. They immediately demanded Larry to leave. Yet once I'm done gathering personnel, I'm going to leave. No, now, he was told by one of the elders. He knew which one this was, and this one did not like humans much at all. With this, Larry turned the ship ever so slightly towards them so that the bow was facing the battle group. "I will leave peacefully once I retrieve my materials." "Your materials? Your ships are on the planet?" "Yup. And once they return, I'm going to leave peacefully. If you insist on shooting down any one of my transports, I will respond in kind." "You think you could face us in one ship? There's nearly 100 of ours." "Huh, I like those odds. Care to test it?" With that, it was a standoff. That is, until all the ships got in. At that point, all the personnel was recovered, and they began to head straight towards Bunchen territory. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. And the elder did not want them to go. He did not want the embarrassment of what was happening right there. As they tried to leave, a few of the ships took some pot shots at the other 4 ships that were there. These were not really warships, well, one of them was. The rest were simple commercial transports. Larry immediately sent out interceptors and stopped the incoming shots, and then maneuvered his ship between the fleeing 4 ships and the battle group behind them. As he did so, over communications came a plethora of screams and yells from the force commanders, screaming how they must destroy the abomination, stop protecting them, let them cleanse their own species. Everything was very tense until they reached Vunshin territory. Once inside, the Vunshin told the force to, in no uncertain terms, go away. The Vunshin are thanked profusely for their help, and the Vunshin, of course, were happy to help. The main reason is that it wasn't just their military strength that has gone up. Human medical technology had helped them out in ways that was unbelievable, even by their own standards. Though Vunshin were the only few species that couldn't really alter themselves. If they did to try and be more like humans, the result would be, well, straight up nightmare fuel, and everyone knew it. However, what they could do was enhance themselves to be a little stronger, a little faster, just a little bit better, and definitely healthier, and they appreciated that so much. On the other side of Vunshin territory, Larry finally reached the new planet and began to drop off his refugees. They were surprised to see, well, everything was there waiting for them, just sitting there, already set up. They were amazed at this. There was personnel. Wait a minute. Those were their own personnel. Many of them ran up and grabbed a hold of their families. Even Greknar's cousins were there and immediately went up to grab Greknar's parents. They were almost in tears as they began to make sure each other was okay. Some of them needed a little repair, but nothing human tech couldn't fix fairly soon. Along with that, there was lodging. Though it was prefab and mainly set up for humans, they weren't going to complain. They can alter it in any way they want, especially since they have equipment with them. Not just tools and whatnot, but equipment to produce their own food if they so wish. They also have enough provisions for 2 full planetary rotations, provided they don't, overindulge. Along with that, inside the prefab buildings, there was all sorts of amenities. There was furniture, hygiene equipment, hell, even running water. They were amazed that humans would do this for them. Why would they do this? Set up entire planets just for this? Each planet itself was set up for each particular species. Obviously, an aquatic species, is not going to live in the same area as a Zeknekel. It just doesn't work that way. Zeknekel don't really care for fish or the ocean in general, which is usually why they stay apart. Still, for most of them, it seemed like they walked out of a nightmare and into a dream. Though some humans had stayed behind to help them set up and alter what needed to be altered, most of them went home. Larry returned, but in tow, he was dragging along Greknar's parents. Thankfully, they were just visiting, as he made sure Greknar realized, no, your parents are not moving in, and they're not moving close. That no, I draw the line here. Though happy to see them, Greknar was still saddened at the news at the loss of many of her kin. Many of the cousins that she knew were lost, those that had adjusted themselves. But what really tore her apart was the fact that her own siblings, those that had refused to alter themselves, were now willingly fighting against them, willingly went to kill their own parents. They didn't understand this. Yet she was still grateful that her parents were still alive. And with that, the kids were introduced. The youngest were petrified out of their mind at first. I mean, when's the last time they saw an 8-foot tall cougar standing in their house? However, after a while, they got used to it. Just like any human kid, they're malleable for the situation, and they just adapted. Eventually, they started examining their grandparents and wanted to know what it was like living on their world, what their culture was like. Even hearing the sound of the verbiage, how they pronounced things, was strange. The kids were not used to using translators, but they still got around it and were able to do so. Greknar's mother just about burst into tears the first time she was able to hold all 4 of her grandchildren like this, and she realized that this was a true gift from the heavens. She looked at Larry and even said so much. Said, nah, I'm a gift from Earth. Everyone got a kick out of that. After the visit of a few days, Larry brought them back to their new home and the new planet. A planet that was teeming with game, with lush open areas, several very forested locations, rolling hills, and 1 or 2 mountain ranges. They didn't have much in the way of oceans. In fact, 80% of it was covered in land. Only 20% of it was ocean. But then again, the forest are not an ocean-dwelling race, so they wouldn't be near the beaches too much. However, there was always some that would say, well, you can always start a resort. Though they weren't thinking about that. They were thinking about how dangerous it was to live there, how they would have to fight to survive, and it's just the way the forest like it. Upon return to his own house, Greknar wonders if they have truly stopped the conflict. Larry said, well, if history has anything to say about it, no. However, right now I have something else on my mind. Because, it's been almost a month since we had a quiet night together. That's right. You'd better brace yourself, she said. Larry looked into her eyes and said, no, that's my line.